as an introduction to the theory of evolution, I thought it would be really good for you to be able to answer these questions. What is evolution? What's the evidence for evolution? And then why does evolution matter? Now this can be a really controversial topic, so we will just stick to the very, very basics, things that we definitely know and that we can definitely see. The definition that we'll use for evolution is the progressive change in organisms over time. Now this has to be a genetic thing. It has to be something that can be passed down to future generations. Otherwise it's just something that's been acquired, kind of like a scar or pierced ears. You're not going to see any babies of tattooed fathers born with giant mermaid tattoos on their arm. You don't inherit acquired traits. So when we talk about evolution, and we talk about changes over time, these are DNA changes that can be passed on to offspring. Now there are just two core principles, or just two basics to understand, and then you've nailed evolution. The first one is called natural selection. Some people call this survival of the fittest. This just means that the environment will favor a certain trait over other traits, and that will allow an organism to survive and reproduce. So here you have a picture of some pests, and as planes fly over, crop planes, and they dust the fields with pesticide, there always seems to be one little survivor that has just the right DNA. So now all of a sudden the environment is going to favor that little bug, which can go on and reproduce and cause even more problems for the farmer down the road. That's natural selection. The second core principle for evolution that you need to understand is the idea that there's such a thing as common descent with modification. So this just means that as generations pass, as you move through time, there are slight changes made to the DNA of organisms, and that modifies them. This picture is a perfect example of this. So there at the bottom, at the beginning of this time scale, whatever it is, you've got an orange bird. And as generations pass, the color of the bird changes and changes a little more and a little more, and eventually you end up with two different species, but they came from a common ancestor. Now Charles Darwin is credited with this theory of evolution and natural selection, and he noticed this idea of common descent with modification. But you need to kind of understand where he was coming from before you give him too hard of a time. He learned about some other scientists as he was growing up. One of them was Charles Lyell, who said that there was such a thing as uniformitarianism, meaning that the earth changes slowly over time, and that the changes that happened 100 years ago are probably the same as the ones happening today. Another person he grew up learning about was Cuvier, and he said that species could go extinct if the right factors come into play. Charles Darwin also learned about Malthus. He was a man who actually studied people, and he started noticing that in London, where he lived, there were more people being born than were dying each year. So what that meant is that there would eventually come to a point, the people would come to a point where there'd be a struggle for existence, meaning that there'd be not enough resources to sustain that big of a population. Now Darwin thought that applied a lot more to organisms like insects and plants than it did for humans. And the last guy, the last scientist who contributed to Darwin's knowledge was Lamarck. Now Lamarck had some great ideas that had to do with evolution, but he was really, really wrong on a lot of them. He believed that evolution happened through acquiring traits. And again, you're not going to have a tattoo and then pass that on to your baby when the baby is born. So that idea was wrong, but it started Darwin thinking about other things. Some of the evidence we have for evolution, the first big one is the fossil record. The nice thing about the fossil record is that we've had these organisms that lived a long time ago, and they've been very well preserved a lot of times. And you can look at them and you can see that there's nothing like them here on the earth today. That idea leads to another idea that, hey, maybe things can live here, but if the environment doesn't favor them, they can go extinct. When you start comparing the limbs of different animals, you start to notice some similarities. We call this comparative morphology. We also call it homologous structures, and that's something you'll learn about a little later in the unit. But here you have some organisms that have different limbs, but if you look, the bones are colored in a way so you can see that each of these limbs start with a big, strong bone. Next come two smaller bones, then a set of green bones, and then groups of red bones. We just think that this is an interesting idea, and it leads to the idea that, hey, maybe we all had a common ancestor. And relating to the comparative morphology, there's also something called comparative embryology. This is when you start studying the embryos of different organisms at certain stages of development. This is a great picture that shows you that a sea lamprey, a pond turtle, a chicken, a domestic cat, and a human being all look really similar. In fact, we all have these gill slits as we're developing. And over time, we've just kind of changed. And some of us don't need the gill slits anymore, and some of us do. You can even start comparing DNA sequences between organisms and notice small changes over time. For example, there is a cytochrome C oxidase gene that most mammals and even animals and unicellular organisms have. And if you look here on this picture, it shows you that the difference between a human and a pig with this gene is only 13 amino acids. There's only 13 differences between the two. There are 66 differences between a human and yeast. What that tells us is that we're much more closely related to a pig than to yeast. Lastly, you can actually observe evolution happen. You can watch it happen in one generation. I explained the idea of the survivor pest or the survivor bug in a farmer's field. This happens regularly and all the time. In fact, it even happens with bacteria. When you get sick, the doctor tells you to take your antibiotic for the whole 7 to 10 days. And the reason why is because if you don't, the bacteria can grow a resistance. They can morph and they can change over time so that they no longer respond to things like amoxicillin and Omnicef and other antibiotics. There is a lot of evidence for the theory of evolution. Things like fossils and asteroid impact sites, things like that. But two of my very favorite pieces of evidence for evolution would be homologous and vestigial structures. So I'd like to kind of share some of those with you. These are the 3 questions I want you to try to be able to answer when you finish. Number 1, what does homologous and vestigial mean? What do those words mean? What are some examples of each type of structure, and then do humans have any of these structures? First, let's go through the definition of homologous. A homologous structure, these would be similar structures in different organisms of a common ancestor. This word's easiest to remember if you can remember that the prefix homo means same. Logous is a little bit like the suffix logy at the end of words like biology, ecology, geology, which means study of. So homologous just really means the study or the observation that there are similar structures in different organisms. One of my favorite homologous structure examples would be the limbs of animals. So here you can see 5 different animals: a crocodile, a bird, a whale, a bat, and a human. And each of these organisms has limbs. Crocodiles have legs, birds have wings, whales have flippers, bats have wings, and humans have arms and legs. This picture shows the blue bones are all very similar. There's a large, big blue bone closest to the body on these limbs, followed by 2 smaller bones, the yellow and the orange. And on this slide, you can see even better how there's a group of bones, and on this picture they're yellow, followed by digits. Things like fingers, claws. In a bat, you've got pieces of the wing and even a claw sticking out here and there. So every different colored bone is similar in the organism next to it on this picture. Another example of homologous structures are shapes of skulls, or the pieces of bones in a skull. Here you have a chimpanzee skull, a gorilla skull, and a human child skull. Now each of these organisms has a two-piece jaw, a mandible and a maxilla. You can see on the chimpanzee and the gorilla that that bottom piece is a lot thicker than on the human, even though they're very similar. And while I was researching homologous structures, trying to prepare lessons for them, I found this really neat picture from the University of Berkeley. This picture shows a mammal ancestor and a reptile ancestor, and it's got different colored bones that kind of match up and are homologous to each other. Now on the reptile you can see the dark blue and the yellow bone at the back of the jaw. When you look for those same bones on the mammal, they have moved to the inner ear area. So those three little bones inside your ear, the anvil, the hammer, and the stirrups, or the malleus, the incus, and the stapes as they're called, those little bones are supposed to, or at least have been thought to be, part of the jaws of our ancestors. And the last example of homologous structures would be neck bones. So in human, from the very base of your skull to about the very beginning of your shoulders, you've got 7 cervical vertebrae. Now as it turns out, something as big and as tall as a giraffe also has just 7 bones in its neck. It's got 7 cervical vertebrae too. You've also got kind of an ancestral looking organism. When we go through and count the bones of these fossils, they all have 7 cervical vertebrae. So because every living and several non-living animals have these 7 cervical vertebrae, we call them homologous structures. Vestigial structures, they're not the opposite of homologous structures like a lot of students think. These are actually inherited structures that have lost most or all of their usefulness in an organism, or at least all of the original use. A very creepy example of vestigial structures is the fact that snakes actually do have legs. You can see legs as in quotes there, because take a look at the skeletal structure on the top of the page. There you can see on the right side that humans have femur bones, or these hind limb bones. Well, when you go through and you dissect a snake and you look at its skeleton, you can find matching and very similar femur type bones, very, very small ones, in snakes. And when you lift up a snake, on the underside of a snake, you can see these little teeny tiny remnants of what used to be hind legs. Another example of a vestigial structure, or a structure that is no longer very useful, is this idea that embryos all develop gill slits no matter what the organism is. So take a look at the far left. You've got fish there that develop gill slits as embryos, or as little teeny tiny babies. Reptiles develop them too. And then as you move to the right, you've got birds and humans. Now you and I both know that humans we do not need gills. We breathe oxygen and we use our lungs. But that doesn't stop us from developing these slits as we're growing. So these evolutionary slits have become vestigial structures in us because they're no longer useful. This nasty looking picture, this is actually an appendix. Well, it's a large intestine and an appendix. So what you see, that teeny tiny worm looking thing at the bottom right part of the picture, that's the appendix. And then the large giant looking tube above it, that's your large intestine. So an appendix actually has a blood supply, which I think is really interesting, because if it was completely useless throughout all of time, there would be no reason to supply that piece of the organ with blood and oxygen and nutrients. So that's pretty good evidence right there that this appendix used to be useful and just over time developed a uselessness. Another great example of a vestigial structure is that whales have a pelvis. So the pelvis inside a whale, totally vestigial. A pelvis is used for walking, and whales don't walk. So this piece of bone, or these pieces of bone, used to once be useful for the whale, and now they just kind of float around and are stuck in the cartilage and muscle of a whale's body.